everybody. Recording live from somewhere. This is Zach Couples with episode number 123 of the Movement Debrief. And today, folks, it's 1, 2, 3. It's as simple as do, re, mi. Because we're going to talk about all things table testing. We're going to troubleshoot some of your common table testing problems, interpretation, why this test versus the other. All types of wild and crazy things are on docket today. Because your boy, Big Z, has got a bunch of questions that have been asked by the people. They will be answered for the people by this people right here. Fam recognize fam. Without further ado, let's debrief, shall we? The first question comes from my dear friend Isaac. Here's what Isaac asks. When do you use standing postural assessments, and what information do you gather from that in accordance with your table tests? Or is it all the eye fooling us? Amazing question, Isaac. Postural assessment, it's not something that I note or indicate in terms of my overall decision making, but what I do use it for is giving me a little bit of insight in terms of what potential strategies someone might be using from a compensatory movement standpoint. The reason why I don't find postural assessment as useful is because it's very challenging for us to determine if an intervention that we gave is effective. I would normally say that you can't change posture, but if you look at Bill Hartman and you look at his Terry project, which if you don't know who Bill Hartman is, I will link him in the show notes, which will be found on zachcouples.com/table-tests. But he's shown some amazing postural changes over the course of months with this Terry fellow. So I think that there can be some change in posture. But that's the key, is it's over the course of months. I don't want to be giving interventions to a client without having a good idea that this intervention was effective. And if it takes a longer time for us to see dramatic postural change, a postural assessment and an evaluation cannot be as useful. That's where table testing is useful. Although it doesn't give the full picture, there's questionable evidence if what we see on the table transfers to everyday life or even changes in posture. But what is nice about table testing is you can see if there was an immediate change with an intervention versus not. You got this move that you like. Maybe it's one of the new moves that is on my YouTube channel. And you give it to a client, you're thinking, man, this is going to be a good exercise. I can't wait to use this on this client. How do you know it worked? If you don't see a change on the table, it's probably not a good intervention for that client to be performing. And you might need to either coach it better or go with something else. You don't get that immediate feedback with postural assessments that you do on the table. And that's why I think table testing is more useful, especially in the short term, than postural assessment. Although we can see sometimes dramatic changes in posture, I think that there are going to be limits in terms of how much we can change that as well. You know, even if, again, I'll go back to Bill's Terry project. He looks quite different from his side profile, but it's not this dramatic change in many respects. Like, I don't think you're going to take someone who's got an extreme forward head and make them go in the complete opposite direction. I think just like with any adaptation, there are genetic limits that we can attain with improving someone's posture. For example, take your favorite power lifter. How elite of a distance runner are you going to make them? Probably not that elite because their structure is more biased towards power-based activities. And vice versa. If you have a very good runner, chances are the amount of adaptations that they're going to be able to create and excel at on the strength and power side of things is going to be nowhere near that other person. We all have these physiological and genetic limits, and I think posture is no different in that regard. And that could also be another reason why I'm not the biggest fan of postural assessments, even though they can give me some insights in terms of what strategy a person might be using. I can really only confirm that with table testing or more dynamic movements. To summarize your great question, Isaac, Table test, you can see more immediate change. Postural assessment gives you small insights, but the changes are generally incremental and occur more over the long term, so it's harder to make quick decisions off of a postural assessment. Awesome question. And yes, folks, if you were wondering, I did bring some Topo Chico. And if I were to quote the philosopher Bill Hartman, it is perfect. Or I should say, and it is perfect. That's my Bill impression, which he denies that it's good. It's good. The next question comes from John. Here's what John asks. Hey, Zach, would you be interested in doing a video on what the best practices tests a trainer can do for their online clients? I went in deep with this in my how to or guide to remote coaching post, so I'll definitely link that in the show notes. Check that out. Let's talk about what tests are useful to perform remotely. What's my current Rolodex of testing that I use to make decisions? If your goal is to improve someone's movement options and movement capabilities, there's only a few different motions I think that you need in order to make some sound decisions. Perhaps the biggest decision makers for me, especially in the short term, especially if you're short on time, would be looking at infrasternal angle and looking at a supine knee to chest test. So can you perform full hip flexion, keep the down leg close to the ground or on the ground? That gives you a few good things. The infrasternal angle allows you to appreciate the structural compensations that a person may or may not be using. And we'll dive deeper into that in a later question. And I like the knee to chest because it gives you a good appreciation for what type of concentric strategy someone might be using, aka where are they limited at? If I can't bring the knee completely to the chest and compress it down, you know that there is likely some type of restriction on the backside of that person's body. If you can't keep the hip extended when you bring the full knee to the chest, you know that there is likely a limitation on that person's front side of their body. And you need that foundational movement options in those areas in order to really elicit any changes anywhere else. Both of those measures, the infrasternal angle and the knee to chest, give you an idea of someone's capability of achieving the stacked position. The stack, of course, would be being able to create the pelvic diaphragm and the thoracic diaphragm atop one another. The bottom part of the stack is a posterior tilt to the pelvis, which if you can't bring your knee to your chest, you're going to have a hard time with that. And then the bottom or the top part of the stack is going to be the full exhalation and dropping of the lower rib cage. And if you can't stack, you don't want to talk to Zach. You need to have that first. So you could seriously have a quick assessment and just look at those two things to see what you got. And many times in my remote evaluations that I do, if someone doesn't have that full, I'll just use that as my test retest until it's clean. And a lot of times if you can get that to improve, you're going to see some great adaptations in the rest of the body. So start with that first. Once you have that, then you can start looking at some other potential tests. Other things that I like, an active straight leg raise is good. That's going to be a little bit more of a bias towards an exhalation strategy or testing the extensibility of stuff on the more front side of the body. Extension, adduction, internal rotation measures are more front side. Well, Zach, how does a straight leg raise look at front side if the hip is getting flexed? The reason why it is because, and I talk about this a little bit more in depth in a previous debrief, but with the straight leg raise, what happens is when you are at 90 degrees of hip flexion with the knee straight, there's a more internal rotation bias in the straight leg, or the leg that's flexed. So that's how I say that it can give you some insight in terms of what restrictions someone may or may not have on the front side of the body. Other things that I look at would be shoulder extension, which I test that now with the elbow bent, going backwards, I should say. The reason why I like elbow bent is because with the elbow straight, it's easy to use elbow hyperextension as a cheat to get you full shoulder extension. I was working with some clients who had like 20 degrees of elbow hyperextension, and it confounded my test results. once I kept the elbow bent, that didn't allow them to have the compensatory strategy that they could use to get shoulder extension. Think of it this way. When you're testing hip extension, most of the time, if you want to get a full appreciation of the movement, you're going to keep the knee bent at about 90 degrees. That's true with like an Ober's test, Thomas test, really any test of hip extension. It seems as most people have a greater amount of hip extension with the knee extended. Same principle applies to the shoulder and the elbow. And that kind of was a light bulb moment for me. It's like, oh, well, no wonder everyone's testing very well. It's because they have all of this extra motion coming from the elbow extension position. Once I eliminated that, I got a much better appreciation for someone's ability to get true shoulder extension. If you lack shoulder extension, that would indicate a restriction on the front side of the thorax in general. It gets a little bit more in depth than that, but in general. Other things that I use to assess backside mobility in the upper thorax area would be shoulder external rotation at 90 degrees and then shoulder flexion. I like the way that Bill tests it with the forearm supinated, the elbow in, so you can really appreciate external rotation. That's the way that I've been testing it. And those are really my big online clusters of big-time decision makers. I think, too, that you could also look at a toe touch and a squat, but I really don't address those until most of the ground-based tests are clear. Just because a standing maneuver is going to be, there's going to be a lot more moving parts to it, and you might not always see dramatic changes in that if there's more local changes that you would need to address. And that's typically how my assessment goes. Does that change if you're a clinician? To me, the answer is no. I really don't think that there's this huge divide between training and rehab. I think the arbitrary marker is pain, but I do think that in many cases a trainer has the capability of working with someone in pain, especially if they're in persistent pain. One of the limitations that a clinician like myself has is time. You know, if you wanted to see me 3 days a week, it's going to cost you a pretty penny unless you're a pro bono case for me. Whereas a trainer, y'all are generally cheaper, or you could be in a group class or a group setting. And that can be really profound for someone who's in pain because they need movement. They need to return to safe activity. And if you're a trainer who's comfortable working with that population, I think it could be really useful. So I don't differentiate what tests a trainer should use versus a clinician. We're both trying to do the same thing, and that's improving someone's movement options and movement capabilities. I think the big difference is where we catch our people. I'm going to catch someone if I got my PT hat on, which, you know, when you're bald like your boy is, you got to wear hats a little bit more often, otherwise you get burned. But I'm going to catch people when they're in pain or if they're deconditioned or somewhere along those lines, whereas a trainer might catch someone who's not in that state, but sometimes you will. So as long as we catch people and we are comfortable within our skill set to work with them, we're still assessing movement when it boils down to it. So I think as long as we stick with those testings from a remote standpoint, you should be in business. To summarize your question, John, you need tests remotely that assess mobility on the front side and the back side of the body. Flexion, abduction, external rotation measures will generally assess backside mobility. Extension, adduction, internal rotation measures will generally assess front side mobility. Create a combination of those. Your big decision makers will be knee to chest, for me, infrasternal angle, and then I'm looking at different flexion and extension measures and rotational measures in the thorax and in the extremities. Great question, John. The next question also comes from John. Here's what John asks. Actually, this is a combo question because I thought these two questions that these fine folks asked blended well together. John's portion. I'd definitely like to learn more about how you make decisions based off of table testing. Specifically, if an individual has some, but not all of their inhalation or exhalation measures, i.e. possesses full shoulder flexion in ER, but does not have full abduction. Does your intervention change? So there's that. What do you prioritize? And then podiumperformance.bne on that Instagram baby asks, hey Zach, when you identify if someone is compressed anterior or posteriorly, do you address bucket handle, primary compensation, and secondary compensation in that order? Great question. So this is looking at the full spectrum of tests, and we can even just stick with the remote test that I discussed. What do you address first? And this is where I think the infrasternal angle measure is really useful. And again, I gotta give a shout out to Bill, because when he released his video on IG talking about the falling, it really made a lot of sense to me and has really helped me be more specific with my interventions, and I've been seeing better results because of it. So you have two strategies. Why did I do 2 fingers? I don't know. 2 strategies, not 4. 2 strategies. You either have a more narrow-based strategy or a more wide-based strategy. And if we look at those 2 strategies, we can see what compensatory strategies someone should have. And if they have anything else beyond that, we know that that's a secondary layer of compensation. Let me get my son to help illustrate this. Which, if anyone wants to give my son a name, please, I'm all for, maybe we can do a poll to see what he should be named. With someone who is a wide infrasternal angle, I want you to think about this. The diaphragm is going to be slightly descended, and that's why the bucket handle action is increased and the infrasternal angle is wide. In that case, the viscera is going to be moving down a little bit, but not as much in comparison to the narrow. Stay tuned. Therefore, there is less of a need for this pelvis to be extremely counternutated, because the counternutation position is there to increase surface area of the pelvic inlet to catch the viscera. That's all. So there's less of a need for that. Therefore, the wide infrasternal angle pelvis is going to be relatively nutated or pitched forward. If I continue to pitch my pelvis forward, chances are, if I do not do anything to counteract this forward pitch, I'm going to fall flat on my face, and that wouldn't be fun. I'm going to do compensatory strategies to ensure that doesn't happen. So the first compensation that a wide infrasternal angle should do is tense or concentrically orient stuff on the backside of that person's body to upright themselves. And that's how you get the first layer of compensation with a wide infrasternal angle. What measures should be limited in this case? Well, I'm glad you asked. The measures that you should see limited would be if stuff on the backside of the body, if I were to stretch those tissues, it would be flexion, abduction, and external rotation based measures. So if a wide infrasternal angle is limited in those things, and they have extension, adduction, and internal rotation, you need to address those compensations first. Now, if you've worked with a wide infrasternal angle, I'm sure that you have seen someone who has limitations in extension, adduction, and internal rotation as well for this type of presentation. Those limitations would be secondary compensations. If I were to draw this in layers, so you have this concentric on the back layer initially and this eccentric on the front layer, if I throw another layer on the front side of concentric activity to continue to keep myself upright, that layer of compensation is more superficial than it would be the initial layer, which would be that concentric orientation on the backside of the body. You have to peel that superficial layer off first. Otherwise, what's going to happen is you're going to have this tug of war between these big guns on the front side of the body and the more deeper musculature on the back side of the body. Big guns are going to win generally. So I have to be able to get those things to eccentrically orient first. Think of it this way. If I'm a wide and I do this big arch in my back, increased lumbar lordosis, I have a flat upper thorax, and I'm doing this compensatory measure, and I'm just falling backward, falling backward, falling backward. And I don't want that to happen, right? I've gone too far, which is something I have an issue with. I'm going to need a big muscle on the front side of my body to bring me back to center. More so than the musculature that I needed to prevent me from falling. Those would be deeper layers of muscles because I haven't gone so far forward that I need to recruit the big dogs to upright myself. Who's going to win? If I had a battle between rectus damn near cildus abdominis and your multifidi, I'm going to throw money on rectus abdominis all day, every day. So I need to get that bad boy to chill first before I go after creating the expansion posteriorly. You're getting the multifidi to eccentrically orient. And that's where the layering thing is useful. So if you are a wide infrasternal angle, your first compensation is concentrically orienting the backside of the body, aka creating restrictions in flexion, abduction, and ER. The second compensation would be creating restrictions in extension, adduction, and IR. I need to address the extension, adduction, and IR measures first before I go after the flexion, abduction, and ER measures in a wide infrasternal angle. And it doesn't matter if you're A to P compressed. It doesn't matter if, as John's alluding to, well, okay, my person has an IR measure limitation, but they have full ER and a loss of flexion. The rules still apply. You address the IR restriction first with whatever you want to use, and then you would go after the flexion-based measure. And that's for wides. For a narrow infrasternal angle, things flip-flop. A narrow ISA, their diaphragm descends even further. That's how the narrowing happens, because when the diaphragm goes towards flat, it changes its line of pull along the lower rib cage, bowing it inward. And that's where you can get that narrowing of an infrasternal angle. That means that the guts are going to be pushed further downward in comparison to the wide. So I have to make room to catch those guts. The way I do that is by counter-nutating the sacrum, anteriorly rotating the SI joints, and increasing the surface area of the pelvic inlet. I make a bowl to catch the goods. Coming soon to a Bed Bath & Beyond near you. Might be on future purchase at zachcouples.com. Guts move down, the sacrum has to counter-nutate. If I counter-nutate with reckless abandon, oh snap, I'm going to fall backwards. I don't want to fall backwards. So what do I need to do to prevent falling backwards? I'm going to tense or concentrically orient, stuff on the front side of the body, boom, to upright myself. Generally, if you want to stretch or eccentrically orient stuff on the front side of the body, you're going to move into extension, adduction, and internal rotation. So a narrow infrasternal angle should be limited in those measures as their first line of defense. Now let's say I overcorrect. Okay, you know, boy, he's falling backwards. Okay, no, I don't want to do the lean back like Fat Joe, so I, boom, concentrically orient myself to go forward. But oh snap, I went too far. Same story. Oh crap, I don't want to fall forward now. What am I going to do about it? I'm going to, boom, tense up stuff on the back side of my body to upright myself again. But that would be a later strategy. That would be a secondary compensatory strategy. It would be an outside layer that needs to be addressed. Think about it, right? Again, now this time maybe we have something like the transversus thoracis downing the pump handle for a narrow, and then you're utilizing erector spinae to bring yourself back upright. Who are you going to take? You know, if we were to throw money down, because on June 4th in wonderful Las Vegas we can gamble again, but if we were to take bets on who would win the tug of war, is it going to be erector spinae or is it going to be your transversus thoracis? Sorry, I'm going to bet the house on erector spinae, and then you're going to have to pay me some money, which if you do, send me a PayPal. So I need to address that outside layer first, which in the case of a narrow would be that flexion, abduction, external rotation based measure. So if you see this wild and crazy cornucopia of crazy measures, you got your narrow infrasternal angle who's got crazy amounts of ER, loss of flexion, loss of IR. What's the most superficial strategy? In that case, it would be the shoulder flexion restriction, and you should do things to address that first before you go after your extension, adduction, and internal rotation based measures. Peel the superficial layers first, then go to the deeper layers. Superseding that, before you get wild and crazy, you do have to make sure that you have the ability to stack. The thoracic diaphragm and pelvic diaphragm have to be able to get atop one another, because that's what's going to give you the potential to create the expansion or improve the movement changes you need to get the results you want. In both of those situations, I'm utilizing a compensatory respiratory strategy. I need to create or put them into a position to have a normal respiratory strategy that allows me the potential to maximize movement options. The most common mistake that I see people make, and past me, and sometimes current me make, is I will go into something fancy where that person cannot maintain the stacked position, and then they fail miserably, they don't get the results I want, and then I have to bang my head up against the wall, or they leave me in SASUC. I don't want that to happen to you. Let me save you time, heartache. Let me prevent you from going bald way before your time. Get the stack first. To summarize your great questions, John, and podium.performance.bne, what order you prioritize things? For a wide infrasternal angle, they should be limited in flexion, abduction, external rotation. If you see extension, adduction, and internal rotation restrictions, address those first, and then go after the flexion, abduction, ER restrictions. Flip-flop it with the narrow. For a narrow infrasternal angle, they should be limited in extension, adduction, and IR-based measures. If they're limited in flexion, abduction, and ER-based measures, you need to address the flexion, abduction, and ER measures first before you go after the deeper layer of compensation. Amazing question. The next question. This one comes from, again, my man Isaac, killing it with questions. Here's what Isaac asks. On the table, if you have someone who seems to breeze your shoulder, ER and IR evaluations, but struggles on the toe touch and squat, as a wide ISA, what kind of secondary compensations could you conclude from that? Let's talk about someone who has a lot, maybe all their shoulder measures are clean, but they can't touch their toes and they can't squat. Those folks are dirty liars and cannot be trusted. Here's what I want you to think about. There was, in the hip rotation explained debrief that I did a while back, I talked about a situation where if you have someone who has full, like a crazy amount of hip ER and IR, the reason why that is because there's so much downward pressure of the viscera that it creates this multi-directional expansion in the pelvic outlet, and that allows for crazy ER and IR measures to be present. But generally what happens with those folks is they likely have a loss of their ability to counter-nutate and nutate the sacrum, and you can either assess that with a knee chest test, you'll see that on an ober, basically anything that looks at extreme hip flexion and extension. The same principle is going to apply to someone who has full shoulder measures. Only this time, the downward pressure is not coming from the guts, because last time I checked, I'm not an anatomy expert by any means, but the guts are below the thorax. So you would need something that is above the thorax to create that downward pressure. What is above the thorax? Your noggin, your neck, and your cranium. Many times, if I have a compressive force or I have concentric orientation or crazy amounts of restriction in the cervical spine, the cranium, upper airway, I could have the same phenomenon that I had with the hip rotation. If you could envision my Topo Chico bottle as being compressive, or you know, I could squish it and stuff like that. If I squish the top part of the Topo Chico, the water is going to be, the sweet, sweet Topo Chico water is going to be moving downward. If this is the neck, the top part of the Topo Chico bottle, and it's squished and compressed, the volume of stuff is going to be moving downward in this case. So likely what you are seeing is someone who has had some type of, I don't want to say extreme, but a substantial concentric strategy in either the cervical spine, cranium, or upper airway, and that's led to improvements in range of motion in the upper thorax. your telltale sign, because I've actually had quite a few of these folks in clinic recently who've had full shoulder measures. But a lot of times if you check cervical rotation on them, and there's a way that I check it is I just look at the cervical spine as a unit and I'll move it side to side. Or you can look at like upper cervical rotation. A lot of times those will be restricted. Especially if I'm looking at lower cervical rotation, when I turn my head to the left or the right, you're going to get spinal motion all the way down to about T4. So if you have a loss of cervical rotation, you can bet your bottom dollar that you have a loss of thoracic rotation as well, at least to T4. That would indicate that those measures are not telling you what you think they're telling you. They're not good. They need to do things to likely still improve upper thorax expansion. And cervical rotation can be a great way of catching people in that regard. Other things I would look at, let's say lower cervical rotation is clean. That's where you might consider doing an orofacial evaluation, looking at temporomandibular joint motion, looking at tongue-tie mobility or tongue restrictions, which I'll link my myofunctional therapy post in the show notes to check that out. Those would be things that I would be looking at. You could also potentially argue that this person may need a referral to someone who addresses things in the upper cervical area. That could range from a dentist, that could be an ENT, that could be a vision therapist, anything like that. But before you go down that route, just make sure everything else is clear. So what I would do in the case of the person who's a wide ISA, or really anyone who's got clean measures in the thorax but they can't touch their toes or they can't squat, look at the pelvis first, make sure that that's cleared up. If that's still cleared up, then you're probably dealing with the cervical on up issue. And if you're dealing with that type of issue, chances are you need to address that in some way, shape, or form. How would I go about addressing lower cervical stuff? Because I think that's totally within our wheelhouse. There's a move that I really like that I got from Bill that involves an armbar with cervical rotations. That's a good way to encourage upper thorax expansion. Any inversion-based activities, I really like that. And really any type of rotational-based stuff with the neck is pretty good for that. Those would be some of the big things that I would consider with improving lower cervical rotation. If you have some issues in upper cervical spine or anything like that, then check out my myofunctional post because that typically does wonders for those restrictions. To summarize your great question, Isaac, if you got someone with clean shoulder measures, don't trust them. Start to look at the neck, make sure you look at the pelvis. Those two areas have to be clean. Chances are what's happened is they've utilized a larger concentric strategy in the cervical region and you need to address that. Do things to improve upper thorax expansion, particularly T4 on up. Make sure that they have adequate motion in the cervical spine, and I would consider doing an orofacial evaluation just to see if there's any issues with that. Great question, Isaac. The last question. I'm excited for this one. Comes from, actually, Javier. Man, 2 questions today. Rock on, my friend. Here's what Javier asks. Hi, Zach. I hope you are okay. I'm stellar. Thanks for asking. I do have a little question for any debrief. Can a narrow have a positive Ober's test, but a negative Thomas test? Can't adduct, but can extend. Good question. Yes, you can have that. And the reason why I think you can have that is twofold. With the Ober's test, if extension, adduction, and internal rotation are paired, with that test, I can assess fuller excursion of those potential movements. I lack that with the Thomas test because I really can only appreciate the degree of extension that someone has. One thing. 2, the Thomas test is a horrendously unreliable test, in my opinion, and I do have some research to support that. There is a link in the show notes that I have, this great article that my buddy Brian Chung was featured on, which I'll link him in the show notes. He's a research genius. You definitely want to check him out. The main author was Vygotsky. Greg Lehman was on this, Chris Beardsley, Brett Contreras, lots of big names in our industry. But it's called The modified Thomas test is not a valid measure of hip extension unless pelvic tilt is controlled. Basically what they did was they had a bunch of people perform the Thomas test, or they performed the Thomas test on a bunch of different subjects, and they put sensors on them to actually assess the amount of hip extension that that person has. Traditionally, you're going to utilize how well the thigh goes downward towards the plinth. And the biggest issue with this is the pelvic tilt on a Thomas test is really challenging to control. If I have someone who has a large amount of hip flexion and I'm not controlling for the compensations that someone could have in hip flexion, they can actually flex the hips way up but still have an anterior tilt of the pelvis. An anterior tilt of the pelvis is going to allow for more hip extension to be present, meaning that the measure is not going to truly indicate the amount of hip extension that a person has. Moreover, if I have someone who has a severe loss of hip flexion and I try to pull them as far as I possibly can, you're going to have the reverse issue. Now I have a posterior tilt of the pelvis, and if I posteriorly tilt the pelvis too far, that's going to also limit hip extension excursion. So unless you control, and what they concluded was unless you control for pelvic tilt, it really is not that great of a test. And moreover, you can't necessarily use the plinth as your marker to assess the degree of hip extension, or the table. What you have to measure is the position of the pelvis in relation to the greater trochanter, in relation to the femur. And that's really tough with our eyes. I mean, they were using sensors to assess this. So for those reasons, I haven't utilized the Thomas test in years. I don't think it's a very worthwhile test. Especially if my goal is to assess complete excursions of motion. Even though I haven't been using the Ober's test as much as I used to, I do think that the Ober's test is a much better measure in that regard. And the reason why is because if I'm keeping the knees or the hips at about 90 degrees of hip flexion, that seems to be at least a middle ground of motion where I'm not excessively posteriorly or anteriorly tilting the pelvis. And I also like that with an Ober's test, you can get through the full excursion of extension, adduction, and internal rotation. And that's why I think it's a much better measure to utilize than a Thomas test. And I would definitely check out this article because it's I talked to Brian and I said, man, is this what we would call in research the equivalent of a diss track? And he said no, but maybe if I ever get into research, I'd make it more hip hop for sure. But please check out that article because it will definitely outline the who's and whys of why you should not use a Thomas test. But now you're probably wondering, Zach, why aren't you using Ober's as much as you used to? And the reason why that is because the knee to chest test, in my mind, is a more important measure to address. Generally, you got to figure with most compensatory strategies, the pelvis is going to be more anterior. Some degree of anterior tilt is going to be needed for hip extension. I want to make sure that the person that I work with can go the exact opposite route as much as possible, which would be a posterior tilt. With the knee to chest test, I can get a greater appreciation of that posterior tilt capability. So a lot of times, I will look at that first, as well as hip rotation measures. If I've done that and then there's still some issues, then I'll start going into an Ober's test, which gives me a better appreciation for full excursion. So I do use it, but the issue is there's other measures that I need people to clear up first that I think are more meaningful than getting that end range excursion of hip extension, adduction, and internal rotation. So to summarize your great question, Thomas test versus Ober's. Thomas test is a more unreliable test, which is why I don't use it, and you can't go through the full excursion of hip extension, adduction, and internal rotation. That's why I think the Ober's test is more useful than the Thomas test. Zach, how would you determine if someone has ligament laxity? I don't, the way I would classify it is if someone has mobility beyond the physiological norm. For example, you should have about 0 degrees of elbow extension. If you got 20, chances are you probably have some laxity there. Although I want us to think beyond ligaments, because it's not just that. It would be an eccentric bias to all of the tissues, because it's not just the ligaments that have to be lax in that case. The joint capsule has to change its structure in order to allow that excursion to occur. I have to have an eccentric orientation of my biceps to the nth degree in order for that to occur. So that's how I would classify laxity, so to speak. And the cool thing though is I've seen some substantial changes in measures that are beyond the physiological norms. So the common thing that I used to look at would be going into shoulder flexion and feeling the humerus glide inferiorly in the capsule. I would do some measures, and that can change pretty quickly. So you can change the resting tension in tissues. I would not limit yourself to necessarily thinking of ligaments being the only issue here. The big thing is to restore movement options. So having excessive motion beyond physiological norms, that's not part of the movement options. That's having too much. It's not good to have too much. It's not good to have too little. You want to be in the sweet spot. So doing whatever you can to get someone to the physiological norm, or as best as you can, is a wise thing. So in the case of elbow extension, I need to do things to create concentric orientation or bias of elbow flexors. That would be an example of that. Good question, Dolman. Get shacked. Oh my gosh, get shacked. You get 35 points. Yes, my intro recording live from somewhere. Wow, this is the first time I've had to admit that it only took 123 episodes to answer this question. But Get Shacked asks, is your intro recording live from somewhere, from Black Star's definition track? And the answer is yes. It is one of my favorite albums of all time. I have a great appreciation for Mos Def and Talib Kweli. I'm excited. They're supposed to be releasing a new album, I think, that was partnered with Madlib. So, which Madlib's freaking awesome. So, yes, that would be the answer. I've been a huge hip hop head my whole life. Just love the music. Yeah, I get a little bit of this going on when I think about hip hop. So, awesome job. Get shacked. You win. You win. That's all I need to say. I think that's a good stopping point for us tonight. That's probably the best question that's ever been asked, so we need to end there. Thank you all for tuning in. You've been a beautiful, sexy, outstanding audience, and hopefully you found this debrief useful. If you want more utility, then I definitely encourage you to check me out on zachcouples.com. While you're there, subscribe to my newsletter, because I got some stuff for you, folks. I got my free class, Human Matrix Foundations, which, if you get it, we get a little lost in the weeds on some of these debriefs, and you want to enter the forest, so to speak. Let me be your elf that brings you into the forest, because Human Matrix Foundations will get you that. It's going to give you all of the basic anatomy, physiology, all that biomechanics that you need to get some understanding of some of the stuff we talk about. I'm trying my best to minimize the nomenclature, but sometimes I have to use it. So definitely check that out. And it's not just that, because you'll also get the Common Compensations Workbook when you subscribe to the newsletter, which allows you to practically apply those concepts. I like that workbook because it really simplifies the compensatory things that you're going to see in common movements like a squat, push, pull into 1 or 2 strategies, which we kind of talked about a little bit today. So check that out. You'll also get 5 hours of talks, both in breathing and pain, a free acute to chronic workload calculator. You'll get to spend every Friday with your boy Big Z, sending you goodies, some of the illest of hip hop, which I can't wait for next Friday's goodies, because I already know the album that's going to be on there. So definitely check that out. If you want a little bit more personal touch, let's say you are someone who's got all of the crazy shoulder motion, but your neck is stiff and you want to know, what the heck do I do about it? Or you want to go through the remote consult so you can better apply that with your clients. That's where a movement consultation comes into play. I will run you through the full evaluation that we talked about. We will find and take care of the movement restrictions that you have and get you back moving and grooving the way you want to, so you can live your life the way you so desire. Or perhaps you want to kick it up a notch, Emeril Lagasse style. You want to improve your fitness goals as well, and you need someone to guide you through that process with respecting your movement restrictions that you may have, well, maybe even improving them simultaneously. That's where my online training program comes into play. We will talk quite a bit throughout the week because now I'm using TrueCoach, which I actually really like the platform. So if you need a good platform, check out TrueCoach. They don't pay me to say that. I like what they have to offer. So definitely check me out there. It's a great program to have. Still got a few slots open, but not many. I'm getting quite a few clients, which is really cool to see. Or perhaps you want to learn how to do that with your people, but you want me to guide you through specifically how to best incorporate that, and you'd like some real-time feedback. You're coaching your clients and you're like, Zach, man, I've been doing this stuff, but I'm not getting the results that you talk about. What am I doing wrong? Let me be your guide. With our mentorship program, I can either sit in on some of your live calls, see what you're doing versus not doing, help you problem solve some of the issues that you're having with your clients, and get your clients and you in business. Once you've scoured ZachCouples.com, subscribe to me on Apple Podcasts and Stitcher. Search the Zach Couples Show. Because guess what, folks? There's 122 other debriefs out there. And we didn't have blue lights. We didn't have fancy lighting. We didn't have all that stuff in the early days. You don't want to watch them. You want to listen to them on Apple Podcasts and Stitcher. While you're there, please leave a review so the fam can keep growing. Social media-wise, I'm on Facebook and Twitter. Search Z Couples. Of course, I'm on the Instagram, baby. Zach, Z-A-C, Couples, C-U-P-P-L-E-S. And last but not least, search me on YouTube. Find Zach Couples if you want to see what type of exercises I'm employing with my supreme clientele. If you want to dive into some debriefs, if you want to see a video of me squatting, fat Zach versus less fat Zach, check that out. Thank you so much for tuning in. You've been a beautiful, sexy, outstanding audience. I want you to keep it real, but not to the extent where things go wrong. Stay hungry, stay learning, stay moving, and I'll see you next time. Deuces.